The mist hung low over Ash Hollow that morning, curling through the streets like slow-moving smoke. It was the kind of fog that muted sound and blurred shapes, turning the familiar into something strange. From her porch, Mrs. Weaver sipped her tea and watched as Claire Holloway emerged from the stable. Leading her chestnut mare, Ember Claire moved with quiet determination. Her hair tucked into a wool cap, her eyes fixed on the winding trail beyond the edge of town. Ember's breath came out in clouds, each exhale dissolving into the air like a whispered secret. Heading out early. Mrs. Weaver called across the fence. Claire smiled faintly. "Won't be long. Just a ride to clear my head. I'll be back before sundown." The words were light, but there was something in her tone, a pause, a faint tightness that caught the older woman's attention. Mrs. Weaver considered asking if everything was all right, but Claire had already mounted and guided Ember toward the forest. The trail into the pines was slick with dew, and the shadows swallowed them almost instantly. Mrs. Weaver watched until the shapes of horse and rider dissolved into the mist. By the time she set her empty cup down, the sound of hoofbeats had faded completely. In a town as small as Ash Hollow, Claire's absence would be noticed before long. She wasn't just another face. She was the Holloway girl, the one who'd come back after her father's death to keep the family's struggling stable alive. The townsfolk knew pieces of her story, though never the whole picture. Some said she'd left behind a promising life in the city. Others whispered about a broken engagement. In the market, you could hear the theories mixed in with the smell of fresh bread and wood smoke. Something's been bothering her. The butcher told a customer that week. Can see it in her eyes, like she's carrying a weight she can't put down. "Maybe it's about Eric," another voice would murmur. "You know how things have been between them?" Gossip in Ash Hollow traveled faster than any horse. By late afternoon, the mist had burned away, revealing a crisp blue sky over the mountains. The forest stretched for miles, a labyrinth of pine and cedar that locals knew to respect. The old-timers told stories about it, about people who went in and didn't come out, about the cliff trail where the ground crumbled beneath your feet. Claire knew those stories. She'd ridden Ember on safer paths dozens of times, but this morning she'd chosen the one that led deeper, past the creek, past the line of red pines that marked the old boundary between town and wilderness. What she saw out there, or who she met, no one would ever be certain. As the sun dipped low, painting the treetops gold, Mrs. Weaver glanced toward the trail again. She told herself there was no reason to worry. Claire had taken longer rides before. But as darkness settled in, unease tightened in her chest. By nightfall, the air had turned sharp with the smell of frost. In the distance, the forest was a black mass against the starlit sky. No lantern light bobbed along the trail. No steady clop of hooves echoed back toward town. Somewhere among those silent trees, Ember's ears flicked at the sound of something moving just beyond the clearing. Claire's gloved hand tightened on the reins. The forest, still and watchful, seemed to draw a breath, and then it swallowed her whole. The next morning, the sheriff would stand at the edge of that same trail, scanning the shadows where horse and rider had vanished. The search would begin, and so would the questions. Sheriff Tom Radley stood at the edge of the trail where Claire Holloway had last been seen. The morning frost crunched beneath his boots, and the forest loomed ahead, quiet and impenetrable. He crouched low, running a gloved hand over the damp earth. HOOFPRINTS, clear at first. Then scattered and faint, led into the underbrush. They ended abruptly, as if Ember had been swallowed by the trees. No sign of a struggle, no broken branches. Just silence. Radley straightened, scanning the distance. In his 25 years wearing the badge, he'd seen people vanish in the woods, but something about this felt different. Too sudden. Too clean. By noon, search parties had been formed. Men and women from town trudged through the forest with dogs, calling Claire's name. The sound carried strangely through the pines, the echoes bouncing back like someone else was calling from deeper within. Eric Sloane. Claire's fiancé arrived at the trailhead late. His face was pale, eyes red-rimmed. "I didn't even know she was riding today," he told Radley. We weren't talking much lately. Radley studied him, not talking.
Why?
Eric's gaze slid away. Just disagreements. Nothing serious. The sheriff had heard that line before, by late. Afternoon, the search turned up nothing. No horse, no rider. Only the whisper of wind through the pines and the occasional snap of a twig that sent nerves on edge. The dogs, restless and whining, seemed reluctant to go further once the ground began to slope toward the north cliffs. Radley noticed it. What? Is it about this trail? He asked one of the older volunteers. The man's expression darkened. You don't know? Folks have been disappearing near those cliffs since before I was born. Hunters, hikers, never found. My daddy used to say the forest keeps what it wants. Another woman chimed in, her voice low. Last one was a boy from over in Redfern. Went riding up that way. Horse came back alone. They never found him.
Sadly?
Filed the stories away. It wasn't one for superstition, but the weight in their voices was real. That evening, Radley sat in his office. The case file already open, though there was little to put in it. Eric sat across from him, wringing his hands. When's the last time you saw Claire? Radley asked. 2 nights ago, Eric replied. She came over to talk, but it turned into another fight. She left upset. I didn't think. His voice cracked, and he covered his face. Radley let the silence stretch. What was the fight about? Eric hesitated just long enough for the sheriff to notice. She said she wanted space. I thought it was just a phase. Been through rough patches before, but Radley could tell there was something Eric wasn't saying outside the station. The town was settling into uneasy quiet, and the diner whispers passed between tables. They were arguing, I heard. She'd been spending time out at the stables more than with him. You think she met someone? The talk wasn't cruel, it was the kind of murmured speculation. Born from fear, from needing to make sense of something that did. By nightfall, Radley returned to the cliff trail alone. The forest was darker now, the pines swaying in the wind, creaking like old timbers. He followed the path until the ground began to drop away into blackness. Somewhere below, water rushed unseen. He took one last look at the fading light over. Ash Hollow, something told him the search had only just begun, and whatever answers the forest held, wasn't ready to give them up. Time had a way of smoothing over tragedy in Ash Hollow, at least on the surface, to trail where Claire. Holloway vanished, became overgrown, her name spoken less with each passing season. The missing posters faded in shop windows until they were quietly taken down. 5 winters came and went. Sheriff Tom Radley retired, trading his badge for a quiet cabin by the lake. He rarely spoke of the case, though his eyes sometimes wandered to the forested ridge visible from his porch. Some nights he swore he could still hear a single set of hoofbeats, echoing faintly in the wind. On a bright, brittle autumn morning, 2 hikers made their way along a little-used trail north of the cliffs. They were looking for a scenic overlook, a hidden spot locals claimed offered the best view of the valley. Instead, they found bones. The skeletal remains were tangled in a nest of brambles at the base of a steep rock face. The hikers froze, unsure if they were looking at a person or an animal. The skull was elongated, teeth worn. When the authorities arrived, the brambles were carefully cut away, revealing more of the frame, ribs, spine, and the shattered remnants. Of a saddle still strapped to the torso, the news spread fast. The next morning, a headline blared from the front page of the Ash Hollow Gazette. Remains of horse found near Old Cliff Trail. Is Claire Holloway case reopening? Forensic testing confirmed what many suspected. The bones belonged to Ember, Claire's mare, but there was no sign of Claire herself. No human remains, no scraps of clothing, no evidence of a fall alongside the horse. It was as if Ember had plunged to her death alone. Sheriff Radley, now just Tom, to most people, read the news over. His morning coffee, his stomach tightened. He knew that cliff. He'd searched its base 5 years ago, or thought he had. By noon, he was at the site. The air was sharp with pine resin, and the cliff loomed overhead, jagged and sun-bleached. Looking down into the ravine, he imagined the fall, the horse slipping, the weight, the violence of the landing. But the rider, gone. Why bring me back here? Tom asked Detective Maya Torres, the new face of law enforcement in Ash Hollow. Because Torres said, "There's more we didn't find the first time." Her words were measured, but there was an edge in her tone. She handed him a small evidence bag. Inside was a single, rusted horseshoe. This was lodged in the rocks. Not much else, but she hesitated. "We'll keep digging." That night, Ash Hollow buzzed again with rumors. Maybe she jumped clear before the horse fell, or maybe someone pushed the horse. Without her on it, others whispered darker theories, ones that involved the forest swallowing Claire whole long. Before Ember reached the cliff, Tom lay awake, staring at the ceiling of his cabin. For 5 years, the silence had been heavy, but still. Now it was shifting, restless. Like the forest itself was turning over in its sleep. Somewhere out there, the truth had been waiting, and now it was stirring, the day after Ember's remains were confirmed. Detective Maya Torres stood in the sheriff's office, sifting through 5 years' worth of dust-covered evidence. The old case file on Claire Holloway was thick, but frustratingly hollowed. Dozens of interviews, scattered photographs, and grainy maps marked with circles where search teams had combed the forest. She could feel the weight of unfinished work in every page. Torres was new to Ash Hollow. She had transferred from a city homicide unit and wasn't used to cases where the answers could be buried under seasons of silence. But something in Claire's story caught her attention. Not just the mystery of her disappearance, but the absence of any clear narrative about her life in the months leading up to it. She started with the people who had known Claire best. Mrs. Weaver remembered that last ride vividly. She looked determined. It's like she'd made up her mind about something. The butcher recalled a sharper detail. She'd been buying less feed for Ember, said she might not need as much soon. The remarks weren't enough to explain anything, but they hinted at change. On the 3rd day of digging, Torres got permission to search the Holloway family home. Claire's father had died years before. The house had been sitting empty on the edge of town, a relic with peeling paint and windows clouded by dust. Inside, it smelled faintly of cedar and thyme. Furniture was shrouded in white sheets and sunlight slanted through gaps in the curtains. Torres moved methodically, opening drawers, checking closets. Most of it was mundane, old letters, faded clothing, riding gear still smelling faintly of leather and hay. Then in Claire's childhood bedroom, she found it. A small wooden box wedged behind a loose floorboard beneath the window seat. The wood was worn smooth, the brass clasp tarnished. It was locked, but the lock gave easily to a thin knife blade. Inside were only 2 items. The first was a ribbon of pale blue fabric, frayed at the edges. The second was a photograph. It was faded, edges curling, but the image was clear enough. Claire stood in the dappled shade of the forest, smiling in a way that felt unguarded, almost luminous. Beside her was another woman, perhaps close in age. Her arm linked through Claire's, their fingers interlaced. Both of them were holding hands. Both of them were smiling. In the background, Torres recognized it instantly, was somewhere. Deep in Ash Hollow Forest, Torres studied the photograph for a long time. This woman had never appeared in any of the reports. No witness had mentioned her. Who was she? Why had Claire hidden the photograph instead of keeping it among her other belongings? Torres slipped the photo into an evidence sleeve. She didn't know it yet. This image would become the first real fracture in the town's long-standing narrative of Claire's life. And it would point toward a truth no one had dared to speak aloud. That night, as the wind rattled the Holloway houses, old shutters, Torres stared at the woman's face until the features seemed to shift in the shadows. Somewhere, she thought, this woman knew what had happened in the forest, and Torres was going to find her. Detective Maya Torres didn't waste time. The morning after discovering the photograph, she ran it through facial recognition databases and cross-checked it with Old Town records. The match came back quickly. Lena Maureen, once a respected horse trainer in Ash Hollow, known for her skill with difficult mares. She had left town suddenly, just weeks before Claire Holloway vanished. No forwarding address. No explanation. Torres traced Lena to a modest farmhouse 2 hours away, down a gravel road lined with skeletal winter trees. A weathered sign on the gate read Moran Stables. Horses grazed in a frostbitten field, their breath misting the air. Lena answered the door wearing worn jeans and a flannel shirt. Her hair was shorter now, streaked with gray at the temples. But the face in the photograph was unmistakable. "I'm Detective Torres," Maya began, holding up the image. "I think you knew Claire Holloway." For a moment, Lena's expression softened, then hardened. "You found that?" They sat at her kitchen table, a kettle hissing faintly on the stove. "Yes," Torres said. "It was hidden in her old home." "You two look close?" Lena's eyes flicked to the window, where frost clung to the glass. "We were more than most people knew." She hesitated, fingers curling around a chipped mug. "Claire and I, we loved each other. But Ash Hollow isn't the kind of place where you can just be that way. Not without paying for it." Torres kept her voice steady. "Why did you leave?" Lena gave a humorless laugh, "'Cause Eric found out." She told it in fragments. Nights spent riding together under the moon. Quiet afternoons in the forest where no one could see them. Claire, torn between the life she was expected to live and the life she wanted. Then, the confrontation. "Eric came to the stables," Lena said, her voice tightening. "Said he knew. Said if I didn't leave, he'd make sure both our lives were ruined. I thought he meant gossip. I didn't think—" She trailed off, eyes clouding. Torres leaned in. "Did you tell anyone?" Lena shook her head. "Who would believe me? Everyone thought Eric was the perfect fiancé. He had the right smile, the right job. And me, I was just the hired help." Torres studied her. The bitterness in Lena's tone was raw, but beneath it was something else. Guilt. "Did you see Claire after you left?" A long pause. "Once, the week before she disappeared, she rode out to meet me in the forest. She said she was going to tell Eric it was over, that she couldn't live a lie anymore." Torres's pen stilled over her notebook. "And then, she never came back." When Torres stood to leave, Lena followed her to the door. "Detective," she said quietly, "Claire was brave in ways I wasn't. But if Eric knew she was coming to me, he wouldn't have let her go." Outside, the air was sharp enough to sting. Torres slid into her car, the photograph resting on the seat beside her. The road back to Ash Hollow stretched ahead, winding through bare hills toward the forest's dark outline. If Lena was telling the truth, jealousy had just stepped into the center of the case, and Eric Sloan was no longer just a grieving fiancé. Eric. Sloan's home sat at the edge of Ash Hollow, its wide porch sagging under the weight of years. Detective Maya Torres found him there, stacking firewood, the rhythmic thud of logs breaking the quiet. When he saw her, he wiped his hands on his. "Jeans, you've been talking to Lena," he said flatly. "I have," Torres replied. "She says you knew about her and Claire." Eric's jaw tightened. "I knew they were close. But that wasn't what ruined things. Claire was talking about walking away from everything we'd built. Selling the stables, leaving town, was destroying our future. And you argued?" "Of course we argued," he said, voice rising. "Who wouldn't?" "But I didn't hurt her." Inside the living room smelled faintly of smoke, though the fireplace was cold. Torres let her gaze drift to a metal bin in the corner, its blackened edges hinting at more than would ash. "Did you burn something recently?" she asked. Eric looked away. "After she disappeared, I burned some of her things. Letters, clothes. I couldn't stand seeing them. It was grief." Torres stepped closer. "Or were you getting rid of evidence?" His eyes snapped to hers. "I loved her." As she left, a woman stepped out from the side yard, wiping dirt from her gardening. "Gloves, detective?" she called softly. It was Hannah Sloan, Eric's younger sister. She had the same sharp cheekbones, but a far gentler gaze. "Be careful where you're looking," she said. Torres frowned. "Meaning?" Hannah glanced toward the house, lowering her voice. "Eric's not perfect, but if you think this is only about him, you're missing it. Should be looking at the people who wanted Claire to stay quiet." "Quiet about what?" Hannah shook her head. "I don't know, but I heard her once on the phone. She was angry, said she had proof, and that someone in town was going to regret underestimating her." Torres studied Hannah, weighing the sincerity in her eyes. "Why tell me this?" "'Cause you're the first person who's asked the Right questions in years. It's driving away. Torres replayed the conversation. The implication was clear. Claire had been holding something over someone powerful enough to erase her, and perhaps make Eric the convenient suspect. The late afternoon? Wind kicked up along the roadside, sending swirls of brittle leaves tumbling across the pavement. Torres rolled down her window and caught the faintest scent of smoke again, as though the ashes of Claire's past were still drifting through the town. She didn't yet know what secret Claire had uncovered, only that it had followed her into the forest, and it hadn't let her come back out. The remark from Eric's sister still echoed in Detective Maya Torres's mind long after she left the small farmhouse. People who wanted Claire to stay quiet. It was an open wound disguised as advice, and the more Torres replayed it, the more it pushed her back toward the cliff where Ember's bones had been found. She arrived before sunrise. Mist still curled along the tree line. The autumn air was sharp, carrying the earthy scent of wet leaves. Her boots sank into the soft ground as she traced the familiar route toward the drop-off. But this time, her eyes wandered beyond the usual search perimeter, scanning the undergrowth for anything. Overlooked, that's when she saw it, a faint break in the vegetation, almost swallowed by years of unchecked growth. It wasn't wide, just a narrow trail curling away from the main path. No signage, no obvious destination. The kind of place only someone who knew the land by heart would use. Torres hesitated, then stepped forward, the branches closing behind her like a curtain. The trail was uneven, littered with roots and half-buried stones. After 20 yards, she noticed something unusual, faint impressions in the hardened soil. Old boot prints, partially eroded, but preserved in the dried mud where the canopy blocked most rain. Her breath quickened. The prints were deep enough to suggest someone had been carrying weight or dragging it. They led deeper into the forest, winding until a weathered structure appeared through the trees. The hunting cabin looked abandoned for decades. Sagging roof. Boards warped by seasons of rain and snow. Its windows were clouded with grime, and the front door hung slightly ajar as if time had loosened its hinges. Inside, dust motes swirled in the light, cutting through the gaps in the walls. Animal pelts, stiff with age, hung from hooks. A single chair rested in the corner, its legs uneven on the warped floorboards. The air smelled of mold, wood rot, and something faintly metallic. Torres's gaze fell on a section of the floor. Near the wood stove, where the planks seemed slightly darker. Kneeling, she pried one loose. A faint smear of reddish-brown glistened beneath. Her training told her it wasn't rust. Forensics arrived within the hour, the quiet of the forest replaced by the low hum of equipment. Samples were taken, swabs, carefully sealed. When the results came back the next day, Torres felt the weight of them settle on her shoulders. The blood wasn't Claire's. The lab confirmed it belonged to an unidentified female, no match in the national database. Whoever she was, she had bled here and no one had reported her missing. Torres stared at the report long into the night. The cabin, the prints, the hidden trail. All of it suggested there was more to the forest than Claire's disappearance. Ember's fate, the mystery woman's blood, and whispers of people wanting Claire silenced. It was all beginning to weave into something larger. She folded the report, slid it into her file, and made a decision. The next step wasn't about finding Claire's trail. It was about uncovering every secret this forest had buried, and the forest, she sensed, was far from done speaking. The autumn wind rattled the window panes of the interview room, its shrill whistle making the silence between Detective Maya Torres and Eric Whitlow feel heavier. Eric sat hunched, elbows on the table, his eyes fixed on a point somewhere far beyond the walls. Hours of questioning had worn him down. But Torres sensed he was still holding back. "You were in the forest that day," she said evenly, her voice as steady as the ticking clock above the door. "The day Claire disappeared." Eric's jaw flexed. For a moment, Torres thought he might stay silent, but then he exhaled sharply, the words spilling out in a rush. "Fine. I followed her. I didn't want to at first, but I knew she was hiding something, I thought. Maybe I could talk sense into her." Torres leaned forward. "Sense about what?" His gaze darted to the recorder, then back to her, about not throwing away her future, our future. She wasn't herself anymore. She'd been meeting people I didn't know, sneaking around. I thought it was about Lena, but it wasn't just that. Tora's pen hovered over her notebook. Go on? Eric swallowed hard. She was meeting someone that day. Man, tall black coat. I couldn't see his face, hood up, head down. They rode toward the cliff trail together. The detail landed like a stone in Tora's stomach. She had walked that trail herself, the one where Ember's remains were found, not far from the hidden path to the hunting cabin. Did you follow them? She asked. No, Eric said, shaking his head. I lost my nerve. Something about him, the way he moved. I don't know. It made my skin crawl. So I turned back. Tora studied him, searching for cracks in his story. His voice was steady now, his eyes clear. But something felt rehearsed, as if this version of events had been waiting for the right audience. You never mentioned this man before, she said quietly. Eric gave a humorless laugh, because no one would. Believe me. And because I didn't want to be dragged into whatever Claire was tangled up in. You think I'm the bad guy here, but you should be looking for him? Torres let the silence stretch, the ticking clock filling the air again. The man in the black coat was a convenient shadow, one who could never defend himself or confirm the story. Yet, the possibility that he existed, that Claire had been lured to the cliffs by someone other than Eric or Lena, clawed at her thoughts. When the interview ended, Tora stepped outside into the brittle afternoon air. Her mind replayed every step of Claire's last known movements, now with this new phantom figure walking beside her. If Eric was telling the truth, then someone else, someone who had avoided notice for years, might still be out there. And if he was lying, Torres knew one thing: lies this specific had roots. Somewhere deep in the forest or buried in the town's past. The truth was waiting. She tightened her coat and started toward her car. There was one more person she needed to talk to, someone who had lived near the cliffs long enough to know. Every stranger who'd ever passed through, the echo of Eric's last words. A man in a black coat followed Torres long after she left the interrogation room. That image gnawed at her, sharper than any confession could have been. If Eric was telling the truth, then Claire's disappearance was just one thread in a far darker weave. 2 nights later, alone in the dimly lit records room of the county sheriff's office, the hum of the fluorescent lights, her only company. She had pulled every file that mentioned hikers, hunters, or campers gone missing near the cliff in the last 20 years. Dust clung to her hands and sleeves, the air thick with the smell of paper left too long untouched. At first, the pattern was almost invisible. Names scattered across years, reasons for vanishing varied. No immediate connection. But as she spread the reports out on the table, marking locations in red on an old topographical map, the truth emerged. Nearly all had disappeared within a 3-mile radius of the same overlook where Ember's remains were found. One report, dated 9 years earlier, stopped her cold. The victim wasn't a tourist or a local teen. It was Thomas Heller, a security guard for Great Pines Logging, according to the file. Heller was known for aggressive behavior and had been involved in several violent altercations with trespassers. Witnesses described him as tall, broad-shouldered, often wearing a heavy black field coat regardless of the season. He vanished in early spring, leaving behind an unlocked truck near the forest's south entrance. No body was ever recovered. Official theory was that he'd walked into the wilderness and gotten lost, but Torres knew better. The cliff trail had claimed too many people for coincidence to explain. She leaned back, staring at the name. A man with a record of violence, a man who worked deep in the forest, a man in a black coat. The connections pressed in on her like the walls of the small room. If Heller had been alive when Claire disappeared, he could have been the figure Eric claimed to see, but then why had he vanished a year later? Was he another victim, or had he gone into hiding? A brittle folder at the bottom of the stack contained a taped interview with a former logging crewman. Torres played it on an old recorder, the voice crackling through static. They told us not to go near the old South trails, the man said. Said it was private company business? But I heard things out there. Voices like people calling for help, then nothing but silence. Torres shut off the tape, her pulse quickening. Those voices might have been hikers trapped, or worse, victims waiting to be found. The map before her was no longer just dots and lines. It was a graveyard waiting to be uncovered, and somewhere in its shadows, the truth about Claire was still buried. The air was sharp with the temps of salt and the distant roar of waves as Torres stood at the cliff's edge. Uneven rock. The wind pressed against her coat, carrying whispers from the sea below, or maybe it was just her nerves twisting every sound into something human. The search team had assembled before dawn, their breath clouding in the cold morning. Light. Divers in black wetsuits adjusted their gear, their silhouettes stark against the pale sky. Torres scanned the drop, her eyes tracing the jagged descent to the narrow strip of rocky beach where the tide was just beginning to pull away. "This is it?" she said quietly, as though the cliff itself might be listening. The divers descended first, their ropes vanishing over the edge. The rest of the team moved carefully along the zigzag path carved into the stone, slick with mist. Torres followed, every step echoing the gravity of what they might find. Hours passed before the first radio crackled to life. "We've got something," Torres was at the base within minutes. A rusted shape emerged from the surf, a horse bridle, its leather long decayed, metal fittings corroded to a dark orange. It had been caught in a snarl of fishing nets, half buried in wet sand. The sight was eerily mundane, yet the tension in the team's faces told her it was no ordinary find. 10 yards away, a diver's gloved hand broke the surface again, this time clutching something far heavier. The sand gave way to reveal a shallow grave, concealed by years of shifting tides. Torres crouched beside it, the stench of seawater and rot rising in the air as they brushed away the last layer. Her breath caught. The bones were arranged as though they had been hurriedly covered, not carefully buried. Among them, strands of long, dark hair clung stubbornly to the skull. Claire Bennett. Torres murmured, her voice nearly drowned by the wind. The forensic team worked in silence. When they lifted the skull, Torres saw it, a single fracture at the back, clean and deliberate. One blow. Whoever had done this had known exactly how to end a life, but there was nothing else. No weapon, no personal items, beyond a few scraps of fabric so eroded they crumbled at a touch. The tide had taken almost everything. Torres stood over the grave long after the remains were bagged. The image of the horse bridle lingered in her mind, the same kind Claire had used when riding the trails near the cliff. If Claire had been here, someone had brought her. And if someone had brought her, they had left no trace except the wound that ended her life. As the tide began to creep back in, Torres looked up at the towering cliff. Somewhere above, the answers were still waiting, buried in the silence. The air inside the sheriff's office felt heavier after the discovery at the cliff. Torres stood in the evidence room, the bridle sealed in its clear plastic bag. Under the harsh fluorescence, the rust seemed darker, almost red, as if it remembered what it had touched. The forensics report lay open on the table. Eric's fingerprints were faint but undeniable. Yet the second page told a different story. Fibers from Lena's scarf, the one she claimed she'd lost years ago, were embedded in the soil around Claire's grave. Torres knew the town had been whispering. Since the news broke, Eric had always been seen as reckless but harmless. Lena, quiet and dependable. Now both were tangled in a crime that had haunted these woods for over a decade. She called Eric in first. He slouched into the interview room, avoiding her gaze. "You touched the bridle," Torres said, sliding the report toward him. "I told you I was out there after she went missing." "I was looking for her," Eric muttered. "If I saw the bridle, I must have moved it without thinking." "That doesn't mean that doesn't explain the blow to her head," Torres cut in, his jaw tightened. "I didn't kill her, but Lena. She wasn't who you think she was. Claire trusted her, told her things she didn't tell me. Maybe she didn't want me to know who she was meeting that day." Torres watched his hands clenched, restless, betraying a tension that didn't match his words. When Lena arrived, she carried herself differently, calm, almost defiant. Torres placed a photo of the recovered scarf fibers between them. I lost that scarf before Claire went missing, Lena said quickly. Eric's lying. He was jealous of her, jealous of anyone who got close to her. I think he followed her into the woods that day. And when things went wrong, she let the sentence die, but her eyes stayed locked on Torres. You think he killed her? Torres asked. I don't think, Lena replied softly. I know. 2 accusations, 2 stories. It's both impossible to prove, both lined with just enough truth to be dangerous. Torres stayed late into the night, cross-referencing Timeline's phone, records, and witness statements. Nothing closed the gap. No weapon was found. No definitive proof tied either of them to the moment Claire died. By sunrise, she stood again at the cliff's edge. The wind tore at her coat, the forest stretching out below in silent defiance. Somewhere down there in those tangled roots and shadows, the truth had been buried for years, and even now, with Claire finally brought home, it refused to surface. The case would remain open. The files tucked into the unsolved cabinet, another story the town would carry in hushed. Voices. Torres lit a cigarette, the smoke curling into the morning fog. She didn't know if she'd ever have the answers, but she knew one thing, in Black Hollow. Shadows kept their secrets, and they were watching still. The snow had melted into the soft decay of early spring by the time Torres returned to the cliff trail. The investigation, stalled by conflicting evidence and stubborn silences, had slipped from the headlines. The public's outrage had cooled, leaving only whispers and speculation. But for Torres, the weight of unanswered questions had never lessened. She moved along the path slowly, boots crunching on damp pine needles, her breath clouding in the cool air. The wind carried the faint scent of moss and river water. Every step felt like a conversation with the land, the same land that had swallowed Claire's voice, her truth, her life. She paused where the trail narrowed and glanced over the edge. The drop still made her stomach turn, the same stomach tightening. Vertigo she'd felt the day the divers surfaced with the rusted bridle, and later, Claire's remains. The memory of Eric's cold stare in the interrogation room came unbidden, followed by the image of Lena gripping her own hands until her knuckles went white, swearing she had nothing to hide. The case file remained open on paper, but in reality, it was another ghost drifting in the corridors of the department. One more stack of unsolved tragedy waiting to be forgotten. Torres pressed onward, past the stand of young cedars, until a flash of something unnatural caught her eye. She stopped. At the base of an ancient pine, the bark had been stripped in one long, deliberate patch. Carved into the pale wood beneath, the words stood raw and jagged. I told the truth. No one believed me. The message was weathered but not old enough to have. Been here for decades. The letters were uneven, as if etched in desperation. She ran her gloved fingers across the grooves, feeling the splinters snag at the fabric. The carving was deep. Whoever had made it wanted it to endure. Her mind immediately conjured possibilities. Eric desperate to clear his name, Lena trying to leave a final breadcrumb of innocence, or someone else entirely. Someone they'd never found. The forest around her seemed to hold its breath. A gust of wind swept through, rattling the branches high above, making the trees sound like they were whispering. Shadows shifted across the trail, long and thin, stretching toward the cliff's edge. For a moment, Torres could almost imagine figures moving between the trunks, riders on horseback, hikers with bright packs, a man in a black coat melting into the dark. Her radio crackled faintly at her hip, a reminder that she wasn't as alone as the moment wanted her to feel. But she didn't reach for it. Instead, she kept her eyes on the carving. The letters burned into her memory. The wind howled again, carrying with it the faint creak of swaying pines. She wondered if the forest in its own way remembered every scream, every footstep, every plea. If it had kept the truth locked in its roots and stones, where no investigation could reach, Torres stepped back, looking out over the abyss. Below, the river churned, cold and unyielding. Somewhere between here and there, the truth still lingered, patient, silent, waiting for the right ears to hear it. She turned away at last, boots crunching back down the trail. The case file would remain open. The forest would remain silent, and The wind, as always, would carry secrets only it could keep.